The Hells Angels biker found the little girl pushed toward a loading dock edge, and his blow ended a midnight chase. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. On a cold and silent night, the city streets were empty, save for the occasional hum of a car passing by. The moon cast a faint light on the forgotten corners of the loading dock area, where the harsh sounds of boots and wheels scraped against the ground. No one expected the danger that was about to unfold. A young girl, no more than 10 years old, was desperately struggling against the hands that gripped her, pushing her toward the edge of the loading dock. Her breath was shallow, her eyes wide with fear, and her tiny body was trembling under the weight of her captor's grip. She had been cornered, with nowhere to run, her cries muffled by the thick, cold air of the night. Then, out of the shadows, the rumbling sound of a motorcycle engine cut through the eerie silence. The low growl of the bike grew louder as it approached, and within moments, the figure of a Hells Angels biker came into view. He was tall, wearing a worn leather jacket adorned with the club's patches. His bike screeched to a halt just a few feet from the scene. The biker's eyes locked onto the struggle unfolding before him, and in that instant, everything shifted. Without a second thought, he rushed toward the girl and her captor. The man holding her by the arm turned just in time to meet the biker's fist. The punch landed hard, knocking the assailant off balance, sending him crashing to the cold concrete. The biker didn't hesitate. With one swift move, he grabbed the girl and pulled her to safety, guiding her away from the dock's edge. Her eyes were wide with confusion, but they began to soften as she realized she was safe. The biker, though known for his hardened exterior and brutal reputation, showed a rare moment of tenderness as he checked the girl over, making sure she wasn't seriously hurt. The girl, still in shock, whispered a quiet, "Thank you," as her sobs began to subside. The biker stood tall, his expression unreadable, but his grip on her arm was firm, protective. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She nodded slowly, still trying to understand what had just happened. The biker turned his attention to the man he had just knocked out, but the man had already disappeared into the night, retreating from the scene like a shadow fading in the dark. As the biker looked down at the girl, his mind raced, remembering a time when he had been vulnerable, lost, and looking for someone to save him. But that was a lifetime ago. Now, it was his turn to save someone else. As they made their way to the safety of his bike, the sound of the distant sirens echoed in the air, signaling that help was on the way. But the biker knew that he had already done what needed to be done. He had stepped into the darkness, and in doing so, he had brought light to a life that had been trapped in fear. The girl, her small hand clutching the back of his leather jacket, was no longer alone. And neither was he. The biker could feel the weight of the night lifting as he rode through the empty streets. The girl, still gripping the back of his leather jacket, clung to him as they sped away from the scene. The sounds of sirens grew distant, but in the biker's mind, the night was far from over. His mind raced, though his hands remained steady on the handlebars. He wasn't used to this kind of responsibility, this sense of duty towards someone so vulnerable, but here he was. It had been years since he'd felt this way. As they turned down a quiet side street, the biker slowed down, his bike coming to a smooth stop in front of an old garage. The place was worn, tucked away at the end of the street, a place the biker called home. He cut the engine and looked over his shoulder at the girl. She was still silent, her wide eyes taking in everything around her. "This is where I live," he said, trying to sound reassuring. She didn't respond, but her eyes softened, and she nodded slightly. He dismounted and helped her off the bike. She was unsteady at first, but she managed to keep her balance. "Come on," he said gently, leading her into the garage. The space was dimly lit, filled with the smell of motor oil and metal. Tools hung from the walls, and in the back, a few old motorcycles were parked, their parts scattered across the workbenches. It wasn't much, but it was his. The girl hesitated at the door, her gaze drifting over the cluttered room. The biker paused, letting her take it all in before speaking again. "It's not much, but it's home. "You'll be safe here for the night," he said softly. She met his gaze for the first time, her expression still a mixture of fear and exhaustion. She nodded slowly, still unsure, but trusting him nonetheless. He moved to a corner of the garage where an old couch sat. The cushions were worn, but it was a comfortable place to rest. "You can sit here. I'll get you some water," he said, his voice as gentle as he could make it. She nodded again, a quiet acceptance, and made her way to the couch. The biker watched her for a moment before he walked over to the small kitchenette in the corner of the room. He poured a glass of water, his hands still steady but his mind in turmoil. He had never been one for compassion. The Hell's Angels had taught him to be cold, to shut out the world, to protect his own. But something about this girl, something about tonight, had cracked through the armor he'd built over the years. As he handed her the water, their eyes met once more. She took the glass from him with a quiet, "Thank you," and drank slowly, her hand trembling slightly. He noticed the bruise on her cheek, the dirt and tear-streaked face. The sight made something inside him tighten, a mix of anger and protectiveness he wasn't used to feeling. He sat across from her, watching as she finished the water. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She set the empty glass down on the table and hesitated before speaking. "I don't know. I was just walking home from my friend's house. And they grabbed me. They pushed me toward the edge of the dock," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker's fist clenched at the memory of what he'd seen earlier. The girl's body had been pushed, her life hanging by a thread as she struggled to break free. It angered him to think about it. He couldn't understand why someone would hurt a kid, let alone abandon them in a place like that. He had his own demons, his own regrets, but this was different. This was innocent. "You're safe now," he said, trying to reassure her. "No one's going to hurt you again." She met his gaze for a long moment, and then, to his surprise, she smiled faintly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to break the wall he had built around himself. He had saved her tonight, but in some ways, she had saved him too. There was a long silence before the girl spoke again. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for saving me." The words hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't used to being thanked. He wasn't used to being needed. But something about this moment, sitting in his small garage, with this girl he didn't know, made him realize that maybe he wasn't as far gone as he thought. Maybe there was still something good left in him. The night stretched on, and the garage grew quieter. The biker sat there, thinking about the choices he had made and the man he had become. But in that moment, he didn't feel like the monster he sometimes saw in the mirror. He felt like someone who could protect, someone who could care. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow or the day after that, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find redemption in helping this girl, in being someone she could rely on. The world outside was cold and harsh, but in this small, dimly lit garage, for the first time in years, it felt like there was warmth. The days that followed were filled with a strange quiet. The biker had been used to the sound of engines, the clatter of chains, and the growl of motorcycles. But now, in the solitude of his garage, there was only the faint hum of his refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock. It was a stillness that made him uneasy, a stillness that let him think. He didn't know why he had acted the way he did, pulling the girl from the loading dock, fighting off her attacker. He had been a Hell's Angel for so long, and that life was all he knew. But here, with this girl in his garage, he felt something different, something he hadn't felt in years. It was the weight of responsibility. He had saved her, but now he had to protect her. He couldn't just let her slip away like the others. He had a past filled with mistakes and regret, but this was different. This wasn't just another night spent running from the demons of his own making. This was something he could fix. For the first time, he had a chance to do something right. The girl, whose name he still hadn't learned, was sitting on the couch in the corner, her eyes scanning the room. She had barely spoken since he had brought her here, and he could tell she was still processing everything that had happened. She was a child, lost in a world that wasn't kind to people like her. And now, she was stuck here with him. The biker moved to his workbench, trying to keep his mind occupied. The clutter of tools and parts that surrounded him usually comforted him, but tonight it felt suffocating. He glanced back at the girl, her small frame hunched over as she picked at a loose thread on her jacket. She looked so young, so fragile. He couldn't imagine what it was like to be in her shoes, to face the world with so much fear and uncertainty. He wondered where she came from, who she was, and why she had ended up in that alley. What had her life been like before all of this? He couldn't help but feel a sense of protectiveness toward her, even though he didn't know anything about her. He turned back to the workbench and started tinkering with a set of motorcycle parts, his hands moving automatically, trying to lose himself in the mechanical work. He didn't like the feeling that was rising in his chest, the feeling that something was wrong, that he needed to fix it. But he didn't know how. The girl, noticing his gaze, finally spoke. "What's your name?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence that had hung between them. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Her gaze was steady, but there was a flicker of vulnerability there, a quiet plea for reassurance. "Jake," he said, his voice gruff, more from habit than anything else. "Jake Morrison." She nodded slowly, as if processing the name. He could tell she was trying to make sense of everything, but it wasn't coming easily. She wasn't a stranger to hardship, that much was clear. He saw the way she carried herself, the way she avoided eye contact, the way she flinched at every sound. It made him want to protect her even more, even though he knew he had no business doing so. "I'm Emma," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma Richardson. The name felt like a small piece of normalcy, like a lifeline in a storm. He nodded at her, feeling the weight of her words settle in the room. They were both lost in their own way, but together, maybe they could find something. "Well, Emma," Jake said, pushing away from the workbench, "you're safe here. No one's gonna hurt you again." Emma met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was small, but it was there. He could see that she wanted to believe him, but she wasn't sure she could. And who could blame her? The world had shown her nothing but pain and disappointment, but maybe, just maybe, he could show her something different. He walked over to the couch and sat down next to her, his massive frame dwarfing her tiny one. "You've been through a lot tonight," he said, his voice softer now, trying to break the tension that had built between them. "But you're safe. I'm not going anywhere." Emma shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around the room as if she didn't know where to look. She was still processing, still trying to make sense of the chaos. He understood that. He didn't know what he was supposed to do next either. But for the first time in a long time, he knew what it felt like to care about someone other than himself. He reached out slowly, his large hand resting on her shoulder, a simple gesture of comfort. She tensed. At first, but then, slowly, she relaxed. She didn't pull away, and that, in itself, was progress. They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the night settling over them both. He didn't know how this story would end, or if he could even keep his promise to protect her. But for now, he was all she had. And for once, that was enough. Days passed slowly in the small garage, and Emma's presence was a constant reminder to Jake of the change he hadn't expected to feel. He found himself waking earlier, moving with more purpose. The dark thoughts that had plagued him for years were quieter now, replaced by a sense of duty he hadn't known was still in him. The motorcycles that had once been his escape now felt like an extension of himself, something he used to run from the pain, but lately, they seemed to hold the promise of a future he hadn't dared to imagine. Emma, too, was changing. The girl who had arrived bruised and scared was starting to show signs of hope. Her small smile had become more frequent, her steps less hesitant. She was still quiet, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. She felt safe here, and that safety was something Jake hadn't realized he could provide. The garage, once just a place to fix bikes and pass the time, had become a sanctuary for both of them. The morning sunlight crept through the grimy windows, casting soft light on the worn workbench where Jake had been fixing a part for one of his older bikes. He didn't hear her approach at first, so when Emma spoke, it startled him. "Jake," she said softly, "can you teach me how to fix things?" He turned to look at her, a little surprised. She was standing by the workbench, a slight look of curiosity in her eyes. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice still rough from years of silence. She glanced at the tools on the bench, then at the bike. "You're always working on things. I want to learn. I've never fixed anything before." Jake felt a surge of something he couldn't quite identify. Was it pride? Hope? He wasn't sure, but he knew that whatever it was, he wanted to help her. "All right," he said after a pause, "but I'm not going to make it easy. You've got to focus, and you've got to be patient." Emma smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was the first time he'd seen her look truly happy since she'd arrived. I can do that, she said, stepping forward. Jake showed her the basics of the tools, how to hold a wrench, how to turn a screw just right. At first, she fumbled, dropping a few things and muttering to herself, but Jake stayed patient. He'd never had anyone to teach, but now he realized how important it was. He didn't just want to fix bikes. He wanted to teach Emma how to fix things, to build something, to learn that she could be in control of her own life. Over the next few hours, they worked side by side, slowly bringing the bike back to life. Emma's hands were small, but she worked with focus, following his instructions carefully. She was learning, really learning, and Jake couldn't help but feel proud. She was more than just a scared little girl now. She was becoming someone who could stand on her own. By the time they were finished, the bike was running smoothly again. Emma stood back, wiping a smudge of grease from her cheek, and Jake couldn't help but laugh. You did a good job, he said, stepping back to admire their work. I couldn't have done it without you, Emma replied, looking up at him with a mixture of pride and gratitude. Jake felt something shift inside him, something that was both terrifying and liberating. He wasn't sure how to navigate this new feeling, but he knew one thing. He couldn't go back to the way things were. He had a responsibility now, not just to himself, but to Emma. She had shown him that there was more to life than just surviving. There was living. And for the first time in years, Jake felt like he could do more than just exist. Later that evening, as they sat down to dinner, Emma asked him something that made him pause. What was it like for you, growing up? She asked, her voice quiet, almost uncertain. Jake set his fork down, looking at her. It was a question he hadn't really thought about in a long time. But now, with her looking at him with those wide, hopeful eyes, it felt important to answer. It wasn't easy, he said slowly, taking a deep breath. I grew up on the streets, mostly. My parents were gone when I was young, and I learned to survive however I could. I got into a lot of trouble, ended up in the military, then the club. He paused, the weight of his past heavy on his shoulders. The Hells Angels gave me a place to belong, but it wasn't always a good place. It's complicated. Emma was silent for a moment, processing what he had said. Do you regret it? She asked, looking up at him with a soft, almost vulnerable expression. Jake shook his head slowly. I can't change the past, but I'm here now, and that's what matters. Emma nodded, and for a moment, there was silence between them. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, like the calm after a storm. As they finished their dinner, Jake realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't looking over his shoulder, wondering what was coming next. He was looking ahead, at the possibility of a new life, one where he didn't have to face the world alone. And he knew, deep down, that he would do whatever it took to make sure Emma never had to face it alone either. The days continued to pass, and a new rhythm had started to emerge in the garage. Jake had become accustomed to the presence of Emma, though he still wasn't sure how to handle this shift in his life. She wasn't just the frightened girl he had pulled from the loading dock anymore. She was becoming someone with purpose, a force of her own. The garage that had once been a place of escape now felt like a home, and Jake found himself questioning his life more than ever before. One morning, as the sun began to filter through the cracked windows of the garage, Jake heard the sound of Emma humming quietly in the corner. He glanced over to find her sitting on the workbench, her small hands carefully cleaning a set of tools. She had become almost as comfortable here as he was, and the sight of her working so diligently brought a strange sense of pride to his chest. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short amount of time. He walked over and leaned against the bench, watching her for a moment before speaking. You're getting good at this, he said with a small smile. She looked up, her eyes shining with a mix of determination and curiosity. I like it, she said simply. I want to be good at it. Jake nodded, impressed by her resolve. He could see it now, that spark of confidence growing inside her, the same spark that had driven him in his younger years. He hadn't known it back then, but he was learning now that it was the same spark that could pull people out of darkness and into the light. I'll teach you everything I know, he said, his voice softer than usual. She smiled, and the warmth of it made something inside him tighten. He didn't know how long he could keep her safe, but he knew he'd do whatever it took to give her a chance. A few hours later, the steady hum of the garage was interrupted by the sound of a loud knock at the door. Jake froze, his hand instinctively moving toward the wrench at his side. He wasn't used to visitors, and he didn't like the feeling that someone was intruding on their space. Stay inside, he muttered to Emma, his voice low and serious. She nodded, her face already shifting into one of quiet understanding. Jake walked to the door and cracked it open just enough to see who was standing on the other side. He instantly recognized the man in front of him. It was Ray, a former member of the club, someone Jake had worked with in the past. Ray had always been unpredictable, a wild card. But this time, there was something different in his eyes. Something colder. "Jake," Ray said, his voice gruff. "I need to talk to you." Jake hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. Ray walked past him without a word, his heavy boots making the wooden floor creak under his weight. Jake followed him to the back of the garage, his mind racing with questions. "What's going on, Ray?" Jake asked as he leaned against the workbench. Ray didn't sit down. Instead, he crossed his arms and looked around the room. "You're hiding something," he said, his voice sharp. Jake frowned, his muscles tensing. "What are you talking about?" Ray's eyes narrowed, and Jake could see the suspicion in them. "I know what you did, Jake. You took that girl in." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't told anyone about Emma, not even his old brothers. It wasn't the kind of thing they would understand, and it certainly wasn't something he wanted to explain. "You don't know what you're talking about," Jake said, his voice harder now. "That girl's none of your business." Ray took a step closer, his face darkening. "You're making it my business, Jake. You've got the whole damn club asking questions. They want to know what you're doing here, why you're hiding out like this. And I'm here to tell you, you need to get your shit together." Jake felt a rush of anger surge through him, but he kept it in check. He couldn't let Ray see how rattled he was. "I'm not hiding from anyone," Jake said, his voice low but firm. "I'm doing just fine." Ray laughed bitterly. "Fine? You're living in a rundown garage with a kid who doesn't belong here. You think that's fine? What happens when someone comes looking for her? What happens when the wrong people find out you're hiding out?" Jake's jaw tightened. "They won't," he said, his voice steady. "I'm keeping her safe. That's all that matters." Ray shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with disappointment. "You don't get it, do you? You think you can just walk away from the club, live like some damn recluse, and everything will be fine? It doesn't work like that." Jake's fists clenched. "You don't know me anymore, Ray. You don't know what I'm capable of." Ray took a long, hard look at him. "Maybe not. But I do know this. You're making a mistake. The club doesn't forget, Jake. They'll come for you. And when they do, they won't care who's with you." Jake stood in silence, the weight of Ray's words settling over him. He knew Ray was right in some ways. The club didn't forget, and they didn't forgive. But Jake wasn't going to let them tear apart what he had built here, not when Emma had started to trust him, not when she had started to find hope. He wasn't going to let that slip away. "I'm not afraid of them," Jake said quietly. "And I'm not afraid of you." Ray gave him one last hard look before turning and walking toward the door. "We'll see how long that lasts, Jake. We'll see." As the door slammed shut behind him, Jake felt the weight of what was coming. He didn't know how long he could keep Emma safe, but he was damn sure going to try. The world outside was closing in, but for now, he had something worth fighting for. He turned back to the workbench, looking at Emma's small hands resting on the tools, her face full of quiet determination. She was depending on him, and he wouldn't let her down. The next few days passed in a blur of activity, but the tension Jake had been feeling ever since Ray's visit never really left him. He kept looking over his shoulder, constantly aware that the club was out there, and they were going to come for him. He had made his peace with the fact that he was no longer part of their world, but he didn't know if they would let him go so easily. And if they came for him, they'd come for Emma too. That thought gnawed at him constantly. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let her go back to the life she had known before, the life that had almost destroyed her. But at the same time, he couldn't keep her locked away here forever. There was a world outside, and Emma deserved to see it. He was trying to figure out how to make that work, how to give her some kind of future when the knock at the door came again. This time it wasn't Ray. Jake opened the door cautiously, his hand instinctively moving toward the pocket of his jacket where he kept a small knife, just in case. But when he saw who it was, his body relaxed. It was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had brought him the casserole when he first moved in. She was standing there, her cane tapping on the ground as she looked up at him with a gentle smile. "Jake, dear," she said, her voice as warm as it had always been. "I thought I'd bring you some more food. I know you've been busy." Jake stepped aside and let her in, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "Thanks, Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. "You didn't have to." She waved him off. Nonsense, dear. It's just a little something. And besides, I wanted to check on you. How are you doing? Really? She looked at him with knowing eyes, as if she could see straight through the walls he had carefully built around himself. Jake hesitated. He wasn't used to people asking him how he was doing, especially not with that much concern. He wasn't used to anyone caring. But something in Mrs. Henderson's gaze made him want to tell her everything. Maybe it was the kindness she always showed, or maybe it was because he knew she wouldn't judge him. It's been rough, he said quietly, his voice low. But I'm managing. She nodded, her expression softening. I'm glad to hear that. You know, you're not alone in this town, Jake. People care about you. You're not as invisible as you think. Jake didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't used to being cared about, at least not in any way that felt real. He had lived most of his life in the shadows, only truly valued by the people who shared his dark world. But here, in this quiet town, it was different. Mrs. Henderson wasn't a part of his world, but she was showing him something he hadn't known he needed, a sense of belonging. He glanced over at Emma, who had been sitting quietly at the table, listening to their conversation. She hadn't spoken much, but Jake could see that she was starting to open up to Mrs. Henderson. The older woman had a way of making people feel comfortable, of making them feel like they mattered. And that was something Emma needed. Thank you, Jake said, his voice soft. For everything. Mrs. Henderson smiled warmly. It's nothing, dear. I'm just happy to see you doing better. And as for that girl, she said, nodding toward Emma, she's a bright one. I can see she's going to do great things. Emma looked up at her, surprised, but the praise seemed to settle in her heart. She smiled, her cheeks flushing slightly. Thank you, she said quietly. Mrs. Henderson chuckled. You're welcome, sweetie. And don't you forget it. After a few more moments of conversation, Mrs. Henderson said her goodbyes, promising to bring more food in the future. As she left, Jake felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was the warmth of her kindness, or maybe it was the fact that Emma had smiled for the first time in a long while. But he knew that he had to find a way to keep this going. This sense of peace, this sense of hope. The next day, Jake took Emma to a nearby park. It was the first time in weeks that they had left the garage, and the change of scenery was refreshing. The air was cool and crisp, the leaves on the trees had started to turn, and the sunlight filtered through the branches, casting a dappled glow on the path ahead. Emma looked around with wide eyes, as if seeing the world through new eyes. It's beautiful, she whispered. Jake smiled, watching her take it all in. Yeah, it is. They walked for a while, Emma chattering about everything she saw. She was so full of curiosity now, her once muted personality starting to shine through. It was a side of her Jake hadn't seen before, and it made him feel like he was doing something right, even if it was just by giving her this small piece of freedom. They reached a bench near the edge of the park and sat down. Emma looked up at Jake, her expression serious for the first time that day. Jake, she said quietly, do you think things will ever get better? For both of us. Jake looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her question. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to keep fighting, no matter what. I think they already are, he said, his voice steady. We're here, Emma. Together. That's what matters. Emma nodded, the uncertainty in her eyes slowly fading. They sat there for a while longer, watching the world go by. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. The world was still uncertain, but for now, this was enough. The weeks went by, and the fragile peace Jake had found in his life started to feel more like a dream than a reality. He and Emma had settled into a routine, one that felt almost normal, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. His instincts had always been sharp, and now, with the weight of the past pressing on him, that sense of unease was impossible to ignore. He tried not to show it, especially to Emma, who had begun to trust him completely. The last thing he wanted was for her to feel the same fear he had buried deep inside. They spent most of their days in the garage, working on the bikes and learning together. Emma had become more than just a student. She was a partner in the work, her small hands deftly handling tools as they both worked on the bikes. Her progress was undeniable, and Jake couldn't help but feel a growing pride in her. It wasn't just about fixing motorcycles. It was about giving her something he never had, a purpose, a way to build something with her own hands, a future that wasn't defined by fear or the past. But outside, the world was changing. One afternoon, Jake was finishing up on a bike when he heard a familiar sound, the unmistakable rumble of motorcycles in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. The unmistakable roar of the Hells Angels bikes, a sound he had once considered a part of his identity. He dropped the wrench and walked quickly to the door, peering outside. His eyes scanned the road, and there they were, just up the street. A small convoy of motorcycles, heading straight for the garage. His stomach turned. He didn't know who was on the bikes, but he knew it couldn't be good. They were too close for comfort. Emma, hearing the bikes, looked up from the workbench and made her way over to him. She could see the look on his face and immediately knew something was wrong. "Who's coming, Jake?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. Jake didn't answer right away. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of what was coming. "Stay inside, Emma. Lock the door," he said, his voice low and commanding. "Don't open it for anyone. Understand?" Emma nodded, her eyes wide but trusting. "I'll be all right," she said, but Jake could hear the slight tremor in her voice. He watched her slip inside the garage, the door closing quietly behind her. He turned back to the road. The bikes were getting closer now. He knew it was only a matter of time before they arrived. Jake stepped out onto the porch, his boots hitting the wood with a solid thud. His mind raced, trying to figure out what the Hells Angels wanted. He knew his leaving the club had never been easy, but this felt different. It wasn't just about him anymore. Emma was here. She didn't deserve any of this. His eyes fixed on the approaching motorcycles, and he knew that this wasn't going to end quietly. As the bikes rolled to a stop in front of the garage, the riders dismounted. There were 5 of them, all wearing the familiar Hells Angels colors. They were tall, broad-shouldered men, their faces covered with tattoos, their eyes hard and unreadable. The leader, a man Jake recognized from his past, walked up to him. His name was Steele, and he was the president of the Michigan chapter. Jake's stomach tightened. Steele was the last person he wanted to see. "Jake," Steele said, his voice as rough as Jake remembered it. "You've got some explaining to do." Jake stood tall, facing Steele with a cold expression. He wasn't going to let this man intimidate him. Not anymore. "I don't have anything to explain," Jake said, his voice steady. "I'm done with the club. I don't owe you or anyone else anything." Steele's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "You don't get it, do you?" Steele said, his tone dark. "You don't just leave the Hells Angels. You're one of us, Jake. You're always going to be one of us. And you've got a responsibility to the club. You're not just going to walk away from it all and expect everything to be fine." Jake clenched his fists. "I'm not a part of your world anymore, Steele," he said, his voice growing firmer. "I've made my choice, and I'm not going back." Steele's expression hardened, and for a moment, there was silence. Then Steele motioned to the other riders, who were standing behind him, watching the confrontation unfold. "You've got a lot of nerve, Jake," Steele said, his voice low. "But you've got something else too. A little girl hiding inside that garage." Jake felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had known this was coming. "She doesn't have anything to do with this," Jake said, his jaw tightening. "She's not a part of the club." Steele smirked. "That's where you're wrong. She's part of the story now, Jake. And we don't forget our own. You've made your bed, and now you'll lie in it. But if you think you can just disappear with her, you're mistaken." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He had always known that the club wouldn't let him go easily, but he hadn't expected them to come after Emma. This wasn't just about him anymore. They were threatening her, and he couldn't let that happen. He took a deep breath, his mind working quickly. "You're not touching her," he said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "If you want to fight, I'll give it to you. But don't you dare think for 1 second that you're going to get away with threatening her." Steele's eyes flickered with something. Maybe surprise, maybe respect, but he didn't back down. "We'll see, Jake," he said. "We'll see how long you can keep her safe. But remember, the club always comes back for what's ours." Jake stood his ground, his body tense and ready. He wasn't going to let them take Emma. Not without a fight. Not without making sure she was safe. As Steele and his men turned to leave, Jake knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The battle for Emma's future was just getting started. The days that followed Steele's visit were tense, and Jake found himself on edge more than ever before. The threat was real. The Hells Angels weren't just a part of his past. They were inescapable, lurking in the shadows, and now they were focused on Emma. Jake hadn't realized how much the club's presence still controlled his life until now. He had hoped he could move on, carve out a new life for himself and Emma. But that dream was slipping away. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not for a second. Emma, on the other hand, had no idea how deep the danger was. She was still learning, still trusting Jake, still seeing the world through eyes that were slowly starting to heal. She had become his anchor, and in some strange way, she had made him believe that things could be different. But now, with Steele and his men out there, that belief was hanging by a thread. Jake had to find a way to protect her. He couldn't keep her locked in the garage forever, but he also couldn't let her walk into the same kind of world he had left behind. He had to come up with a plan. The first step was making sure Emma was safe. He had to get her out of town, away from everything, away from the club, away from the people who would use her to get to him. Jake spent the next few days quietly preparing. He packed what little they needed, making sure to keep things as normal as possible for Emma. He didn't want her to feel like anything was wrong, not yet. He needed time to figure things out, time to make sure the path forward was clear. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, Jake took Emma for a walk around the block. They were quiet, but the tension was thick in the air. Emma could sense it, even if she didn't fully understand why Jake was acting different. She had seen him like this before, distant, focused, as though something was weighing on him. But she didn't press him. She knew Jake didn't talk much about the past, and she had learned to let him have his space. But that didn't stop her from worrying. "Jake," Emma said softly as they walked down the sidewalk. "Are we going somewhere soon? Like far away?" Jake glanced down at her, his heart aching. He hated lying to her, but he couldn't risk telling her the truth. "Not yet. Maybe," he said, his voice calm. "But don't worry. We'll be all right." Emma nodded, but she didn't look convinced. They continued walking, and Jake kept his eyes on the street ahead, scanning the shadows for any signs of danger. It wasn't long before he heard the unmistakable sound of motorcycles in the distance. His body tensed, and he looked around quickly. The last thing he needed was to be caught off guard. He turned to Emma, his voice low and urgent. "Go back to the garage, now. Lock the door and stay inside." Emma's eyes widened, and she knew something was wrong. "Jake, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake took her shoulders, guiding her back toward the garage. "Just go, Emma. Please. I'll be right behind you." She hesitated, then nodded, sensing the gravity in his tone. She turned and ran toward the garage, disappearing behind the door. Jake took a deep breath and turned to face the street. The motorcycles were closer now, their engines roaring as they approached. He didn't wait for them to come to him. He started walking toward the sound, his steps steady but quick. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. He had made his choice, and now he had to face the consequences. The motorcycles came into view, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. There were 5 of them, just like before, and Steele was at the front, his eyes cold and unwavering as he looked at Jake. The other riders were silent, their expressions unreadable. Jake stood tall, his posture defiant, but inside, his mind was racing. He had to protect Emma, no matter what. "You don't learn, do you, Jake?" Steele said, his voice rough with anger. "You think you can just walk away from the club, from everything we built together? You're still one of us." Jake shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I'm not a part of your world anymore, Steele. I'm done with that life." Steele's eyes darkened, and he stepped forward. "You can't just leave. You think we'll let you? You think we'll let you take what's ours and walk away?" Jake's hand clenched into a fist, but he stayed calm. "I don't care what you think. I'm done." Steele's gaze flickered over Jake, a mix of fury and something else. Maybe respect, maybe regret. "You really think you can keep her safe?" Steele said, his voice low. "You're nothing without us, Jake. You've always been nothing." Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. "She's not a part of this," he said firmly. "You leave her out of it." Steele laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You can't hide from us forever, Jake. You can't run. We'll find you, and we'll find her." Jake's eyes locked onto Steele's, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. Steele wasn't just threatening him. He was threatening everything Jake had come to care about. Jake took a deep breath, his voice steady. "You'll have to go through me first," he said, his tone resolute. Steele looked at him for a long moment, and then, without another word, he turned and motioned for the others to follow. "This isn't over, Jake," he said over his shoulder as he walked away. Jake stood there, watching them go, his mind racing. They would be back. He knew that. And when they returned, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But Jake wasn't going to let them take Emma. Not without a fight. Not without making sure she had a chance to live the life she deserved. The days following Steele's visit were filled with a strange sense of tension that Jake couldn't shake off. Despite the quiet of the small garage, the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. Every time Jake glanced at Emma, his protective instincts flared up. He knew she was safe for now, but the danger wasn't over. Steele and his crew would be back. He had seen it in Steele's eyes. The club would never let him walk away without consequences. He couldn't afford to sit back and wait for them to make their move. He needed to act before they came for her. Jake spent the next few days planning, gathering supplies, and fortifying the garage. He even called in a few favors from old friends, people who owed him or who were willing to help, knowing what he was up against. Emma, meanwhile, had noticed the change in Jake. She could see the tension in his posture, the way his eyes scanned every person who passed by. She knew something was wrong, but Jake kept reassuring her that everything was fine. As much as he tried to keep her calm, she could sense the unease in him. One evening, after they finished working on one of the bikes, Emma sat across from Jake, her face serious. "Jake, are we going to have to leave here?" she asked softly. Jake's heart clenched at the question. He had been trying to shield her from the truth, but he knew the time had come. "I don't know yet, Emma," he said, his voice steady but filled with concern. "But if we do, I'll make sure you're safe." Emma didn't say anything more, but her eyes followed Jake's every movement as if trying to read him, to understand what was going on inside his head. Jake couldn't bring himself to lie to her any longer. She deserved the truth, even if it meant breaking her trust. "Steele and his men, they won't stop, Emma," Jake said, his voice quiet. "They'll come back, and I can't keep you safe here forever." Emma's eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded, as if accepting the truth. She had known something was coming, but hearing it from Jake made it real. The room felt colder as the weight of Jake's words settled between them. For the first time in a while, the future seemed uncertain again. But Jake wasn't going to let fear control them. He had spent enough time running from the past. Now he was going to face it head on, for Emma's sake. He couldn't let her go through the same things he had. That night, after Emma went to bed, Jake sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing. He couldn't stay in this town forever. He had made his decision. He was going to leave, get Emma out of here before the club could reach them. But the question was, where could they go? He needed a place that was far enough away, a place where Steele couldn't find them. He thought about the old house his mother had left him, a rundown place in the mountains. It wasn't much, but it would be safe. It had been years since he had been there, but it was his only option. The next morning, he started packing, moving quickly as if the urgency in his chest would help him finish faster. Emma woke up to find the bags packed, the garage empty except for a few things Jake had left behind. She stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. "Jake?" she called softly. He turned to look at her, his expression firm. "We're leaving today, Emma. It's the only way to keep you safe." Emma's face was a mixture of emotions, fear, confusion, but also a strange sense of trust. She had no idea where they were going, but she knew Jake would protect her. She didn't ask questions. "Okay," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that filled her. As they loaded the last of their things into the truck, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His eyes scanned the street, looking for any sign of trouble. He knew it was only a matter of time before Steele found them. He just hoped they could make it out of town before the club caught up with them. The drive was long, and as the miles passed, Jake could feel the tension slowly draining from his body. He kept his eyes on the road, focusing on the task at hand. He had one goal now, to get Emma to safety. The mountains were close now, the trees thick with the scent of pine, and the air cool and crisp. It was the perfect place to disappear. He had learned long ago how to live off the grid, how to keep people from finding him. He had always relied on that skill to survive, and now he was going to use it to protect Emma. They reached the old house just before nightfall. It was as Jake remembered it, small, worn, but solid. The porch creaked under his weight as he stepped out of the truck, looking around at the land that stretched out before them. It was peaceful, isolated, and that was exactly what they needed. Emma climbed out of the truck and looked around, her eyes wide. "Is this where we're going to stay?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. Jake nodded. "For now, yes. This place is ours, Emma. No one can find us here." They walked into the house together, the door creaking as Jake opened it. The inside was just as he remembered. Empty, dusty, but with the promise of something more. This was the start of their new life. A life where Jake could finally protect Emma, where they could be safe from the world that had chased them here. But even as they settled in, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the peace wouldn't last. The club would come. They always did. And when they did, Jake would be ready. For Emma, for the future they were building together, he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. The weeks that followed were marked by a strange stillness that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Jake and Emma had settled into a routine at the old house in the mountains, but the quiet was never truly comforting. Every sound, from the rustling of leaves to the howling wind, seemed to trigger a sense of unease in Jake. The club was out there, somewhere, and he knew that sooner or later, they would come for him. They would come for Emma. His mind couldn't stop racing, and every time he glanced at her, he felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. She had started to relax, to let herself enjoy the simple moments again. The sound of birds chirping outside, the warmth of a fire crackling in the fireplace, the quiet peace that came with being far away from the life they had left behind. She didn't know the full extent of the danger they were in, but Jake had no intention of telling her. He couldn't afford to burden her with his fears. Emma had a right to be a kid, to enjoy this fleeting moment of safety. She had already seen too much pain for someone so young. It was early one morning when the first sign of trouble appeared. Jake had been out on the porch, working on one of the bikes, when he heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. His heart skipped a beat as he stood up, eyes narrowing. It was too early for anyone to be coming up the mountain road. He quickly scanned the area, looking for any sign of what might be happening. The truck came into view, kicking up dust as it made its way down the narrow dirt path. It wasn't a vehicle he recognized, and his gut told him something was wrong. He moved toward the door, his hand hovering near the knife he always kept at his side. Emma was inside, still asleep, but Jake didn't want to take any chances. He couldn't risk her seeing whatever was coming. As the truck came to a stop, Jake stayed hidden, watching from the shadows. He knew that anyone who came this far into the mountains had a reason to be here. It wasn't a place you visited on a whim. The door of the truck opened, and a man stepped out, tall, with a rugged face and a look of someone who had spent too much time in the sun. He was dressed in casual clothes, but there was something about the way he carried himself that set Jake on edge. He didn't recognize the man, but the sense of familiarity gnawed at him. The man stood for a moment, scanning the surroundings, before walking toward the house. Jake's instincts kicked in. Whoever this was, he wasn't here for friendly reasons. He needed to protect Emma, and he couldn't afford to be seen. He ducked behind the porch, railing, holding his breath as the man approached. The steps creaked under the stranger's boots as he walked up to the door, raising his hand to knock. Jake couldn't wait any longer. He had to act. He slipped into the garage, grabbed the wrench off the workbench, and made his way toward the back door. He would take this guy down before he had a chance to get inside. He had been in too many tight situations not to know how to handle a threat. As he reached the back of the house, Jake could hear the man's voice through the door, low and muffled, but unmistakable. "I know you're in there, Jake," the man said. Jake's blood ran cold. It was Steele. He had come for him, for Emma. There was no turning back now. Steele wasn't just some old acquaintance. He was the leader of the Hells Angels, the man who had made it clear that Jake would never be allowed to walk away. Jake tightened his grip on the wrench, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no choice. He had to face him. He stepped forward, moving quickly and quietly, and then threw open the back door. Steele was standing in the kitchen, his back to Jake, as if he had been waiting for him. He turned around slowly, a smirk on his face. "Did you really think you could just disappear, Jake?" Steele's voice was cold, full of menace. Jake didn't answer. He moved quickly, swinging the wrench toward Steele's head. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and Steele staggered back, surprised but not down. Jake wasn't sure what came over him in that moment. Rage? Fear? All he knew was that Steele couldn't get any closer to Emma. Steele wiped the blood from his lip and grinned. "You still have that fight in you, huh?" he sneered. "But you're running out of time." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't let Steele get to Emma. He wouldn't. He lunged forward again, swinging the wrench with all his might. But Steele was faster. He ducked under Jake's arm and tackled him to the ground. The two men struggled, fists flying, each trying to land a decisive blow. Jake could feel his strength draining, but he wasn't about to let Steele win. Not this time. Not when Emma's life was at stake. He twisted his body, using the momentum to throw Steele off of him. He jumped to his feet and grabbed the wrench again, ready for the next round. But before Steele could recover, a loud voice interrupted them. "Jake, stop!" Emma's voice echoed through the house, sharp and desperate. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, her wide eyes filled with fear. "Please," she whispered. "Don't hurt him." Jake felt a wave of guilt crash over him. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He wasn't supposed to drag her into this violence. Steele saw the moment of hesitation and grinned, a look of triumph crossing his face. "See? She's already in it, Jake," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You can't protect her forever." Jake looked at Emma, her innocent face pleading with him. She wasn't ready for this world, and Jake wasn't going to let her face it. Not if he could help it. He dropped the wrench and stepped away from Steele, his hands raised. "You don't get to do this," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "You don't get to take her." Steele narrowed his eyes, but Jake stood firm. The fight was over, at least for now. Jake wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The tension in the air was thick as Jake stood his ground, his eyes locked on Steele. The battle was no longer about fists or wrench swings. It had turned into something deeper, something more personal. Steele's smile had faded, but his cold eyes never wavered. He wasn't leaving without a fight, and Jake knew it. He glanced at Emma, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. She had stepped into a world she wasn't ready for, and Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. This wasn't the life he wanted for her. But Steele wasn't about to let him walk away from the past without consequences. Steele stood tall, dusting himself off after the struggle. He wiped the blood from his lip, still grinning, though it was more of a sneer now. "You think you can protect her forever?" Steele asked, his voice low, but carrying the same menace Jake had always known. "You think you can hide in the mountains and forget about everything? You're still one of us, Jake. You can't outrun the club." Jake's jaw tightened, his body still coiled with adrenaline. He had been running for years, but the truth was, he could never fully outrun his past. Not now, not with Emma's future hanging in the balance. But he wasn't going to let Steele take her. Not without a fight. "I'm done with the club," Jake said, his voice steady, even though his hands were shaking with the effort it took to keep his calm. "I don't owe you anything, and I'm not letting you drag her back into that life." Steele's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something in his gaze, maybe admiration, maybe anger. It was hard to tell. "You've always been a stubborn bastard," Steele muttered, taking a step back. "But you don't get to make the rules anymore. The club doesn't work like that. You've got a debt to pay, Jake, and you'll pay it one way or another." Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing as he weighed his options. The club wasn't going to let this go. He knew that. But for the first time in his life, Jake was starting to feel something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. Not just to survive, but to protect. To build something for Emma. She deserved better than the world he had come from. She deserved a future free of fear and violence. And Jake was going to make sure she got it. "You can't take her," Jake said, his voice firm. "And you can't make me go back to that life. I've made my choice." Steele's grin returned, but it wasn't the same. There was a flash of something cold in his eyes as he looked past Jake, toward Emma. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This isn't over, Jake. Not by a long shot." Jake didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of what Steele might do. He had faced worse, much worse, in the past. But now, the stakes were higher. He had something worth protecting, something Steele didn't understand. Steele turned and walked toward the door, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. "I'll be back," he called over his shoulder. "And when I come, you'll be ready to pay your debt." Jake stayed where he was, watching as Steele and his crew filed out of the house, their footsteps fading into the distance. As the last motorcycle roared to life and disappeared down the mountain road, Jake let out the breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. But even as the immediate threat faded, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Steele's words echoed in his mind. "When I come, you'll be ready to pay your debt." The weight of those words settled heavily on his shoulders. Jake turned around and went inside the house, locking the door behind him. He found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, staring down at them as if she was trying to make sense of everything. "Are you okay?" Jake asked softly, walking over to her. Emma didn't look up right away. She was processing, trying to understand what had just happened. She had seen the anger, the violence, and the fear in both Jake and Steele, and she was trying to make sense of it all. "What did he mean?" she asked quietly. "What debt?" Jake knelt down beside her, his heart aching as he saw the fear in her eyes. He had promised to protect her, but he hadn't been prepared for this. "It's nothing, Emma," Jake said, trying to reassure her, though his voice trembled slightly. "It's just a part of my past. I'll handle it. I won't let anything happen to you." Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with an understanding far beyond her years. She didn't speak, but Jake could see that she was beginning to understand the weight of what was at stake. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's heart clenched at the words. He hadn't realized how much Emma had come to mean to him until that moment. She wasn't just a girl he had saved from danger. She was someone he had come to care about deeply, and he wasn't going to let anyone take her from him. He stood up, wiping the dust off his jeans. "I'm not alone, Emma," he said, his voice steady again. "And neither are you. We're in this together." The quiet, peaceful life they had started to build was over. But as the weight of his past came crashing back, Jake knew one thing for sure. He was going to fight for Emma. He was going to fight for her future. And nothing, not Steele, not the club, and not even his own past, was going to stand in his way. The following days were tense and filled with a sense of urgency that Jake couldn't shake off. The reality of what they were facing had settled in. Steele and his men were still out there, and they were coming. Jake knew that no matter how far he tried to run, the past wouldn't let him go. His former brothers in the Hells Angels would never stop looking for him, especially now that they knew he had something they wanted. Emma. She had become his world, the one thing he could no longer live without. And that was what terrified him the most. He couldn't let them take her. He couldn't let the past destroy the future he was trying to build for them. The house in the mountains had been their sanctuary, but Jake knew it was no longer safe. He had promised Emma that he would protect her, but how could he do that when his past was catching up with him? He spent his nights planning, strategizing, trying to figure out a way to keep them both safe. But the days were filled with moments of normalcy, with Emma helping him work on the bikes, with the two of them sitting together, talking about things that didn't involve violence or danger. He had almost convinced himself that maybe, just maybe, they could make it. Then one morning, everything changed. Jake was in the garage, working on a motorcycle when he heard the unmistakable sound of engines roaring in the distance. His heart dropped. It wasn't a feeling he could ignore. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, it felt like a punch to the gut. He quickly looked over at Emma, who was sitting on the couch inside, reading a book. She didn't hear the bikes yet, but Jake did, and he knew what it meant. He stepped outside, his body tensing as the rumble of motorcycles grew louder. His eyes scanned the road, and there they were, coming down the mountain path. The club, the same group of men who had come for him before. Jake's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to let his fear show. He had to protect Emma. He turned quickly and walked back inside, shutting the door quietly behind him. "Emma," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Stay inside. Don't come out until I tell you." Emma looked up from her book, a puzzled expression crossing her face. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Jake didn't answer right away. He wasn't going to lie to her, but he didn't want to frighten her either. "Just do as I say, okay?" he said firmly. "Lock the door and stay here." Emma hesitated for a moment, then nodded, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "I will," she said quietly. Jake stepped outside, closing the door behind him. His heart was pounding, but he kept his steps steady. He knew this could be the end of everything he had tried to build. But he wasn't going to let them take Emma. Not without a fight. The motorcycles came into view, 5 of them, roaring as they pulled into the driveway. Jake stood his ground, waiting. He wasn't going to run. Not this time. Steele led the group, his eyes locking onto Jake's from the moment he stepped off his bike. There was no surprise in Steele's gaze, just cold, calculated menace. "You're making a big mistake, Jake," Steele said, his voice low but sharp. "You think you can just walk away from everything? From the club? From us?" Jake stood tall, his jaw clenched, but he didn't flinch. "I've walked away. I'm done with that life. And I'm done with you." Steele chuckled darkly, the sound grating against Jake's nerves. You're not done, Jake. You're part of this, whether you like it or not. And you'll never escape what you owe. Jake's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice steady. I owe you nothing. You took everything from me, and I'm done paying. Now leave. This is my life now. Steele's eyes flickered with something like recognition, but the smile never left his face. You really think you can keep her safe? Steele asked, glancing toward the house, toward Emma. Jake's heart clenched. He knew exactly where Steele was going with this. She's not a part of this, Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. You leave her out of it. Steele raised an eyebrow. She's already in it, Jake. She's always going to be a part of it now. You think the club's going to let her go? Jake stepped forward, his stance defensive, but his eyes were unwavering. You won't touch her. I won't let you. Steele took a step closer, but Jake held his ground. You don't control me anymore, Jake said, his voice firm, his grip tightening. Steele's grin faltered, but only for a moment. You're still one of us, Jake, he said quietly, his voice dropping. And we don't forget. We don't let go. Jake's pulse raced as he stared at Steele, but inside, he was calm. He knew what he had to do. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Jake said, his voice full of resolve. And I'll never let you hurt her. Steele's face tightened, but he didn't move. Instead, he turned to the men behind him and nodded. This isn't over, Jake, Steele said. We'll be back. And next time, you won't have anywhere to hide. With that, the group turned and walked back to their bikes, the engines roaring to life as they disappeared down the mountain. Jake stood there, watching them go, but his mind was already focused on Emma. He couldn't let his guard down. He couldn't let her go through this. He had to make sure she stayed safe. And if that meant fighting, then that's what he would do. Because this time, he wasn't running. This time, he was going to stand and fight for the future he wanted with her. It had been a week since the Hells Angels had left. The silence in the mountains was heavier than ever, a stark contrast to the noise of motorcycles that had come so close to breaking everything Jake had fought to protect. The days felt long, stretching into endless uncertainty. Every noise outside, every rustling of the trees, made Jake's heart race. He couldn't stop looking over his shoulder. He couldn't stop thinking about Emma. She was in the next room, reading a book she had found on one of their trips to town. She was quiet, calm, and at peace, but Jake knew better than to trust that calm. He had seen what could happen when you let your guard down, and the Hells Angels had made it clear they weren't finished with him yet. Jake sat in the dim light of the kitchen, his eyes scanning the papers spread out in front of him. He had been researching places, scouring for options, trying to find a way to get Emma out of here for good. The old house wasn't safe anymore. There was no such thing as hiding from the club. The plan had been simple, to live a quiet life away from the violence. But it was becoming clearer by the day that violence wasn't something Jake could ever escape, not for long. The moment you ran, the moment you looked for peace, someone would always find you. He had learned that the hard way. Emma's soft voice broke him from his thoughts. Jake, she said, walking into the room, the book still in her hands. Are you okay? Jake looked up at her, his heart aching at the concern in her eyes. He smiled weakly, trying to hide the worry that had become his constant companion. Yeah, just thinking about stuff, he replied, setting the papers aside. We'll figure it out. I promise. Emma hesitated for a moment, then sat down across from him. I know you're scared, she said quietly. I can see it. Jake's heart tightened. She was too perceptive for her age. She had seen the tension in him, felt the shift in the air. I'm not scared, he said, though it was a lie. I'm just trying to keep you safe, Emma. That's all that matters. Emma didn't argue. She simply looked at him with a quiet understanding, something beyond her years. It was the kind of trust that made Jake want to do better, to be better, for her. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the distant mountain range. His mind raced as he weighed his options. The Hells Angels wouldn't give up, but that didn't mean he had to run forever. There had to be a way to end this, to keep Emma safe and start fresh somewhere new. But for that to happen, Jake would need help. And there was only one person he could turn to, someone who had been there before, someone who understood the fight. He had to call his old friend, Pete Hawkins. Pete was the kind of man who didn't ask questions, who didn't judge. Pete had been in the game long enough to know what it took to survive, and he was one of the few people Jake trusted. It wasn't a call Jake wanted to make. He hated asking for help, hated admitting that he couldn't do everything on his own. But Emma's safety was everything now. He didn't have a choice. He reached for his phone and dialed Pete's number. It rang a few times before Pete picked up. Jake. Pete's voice was rough, but there was a familiarity in it that Jake hadn't realized he missed. What's going on, man? Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. I need your help, he said simply. It's time to get out of here. The Hells Angels won't stop coming. They're looking for me, looking for her. I can't do this alone. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Pete was silent, and Jake could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background. You're in deep, aren't you? Pete said, his tone shifting. All right, I'll help you. But this is going to get ugly, Jake. You know that, right? Jake nodded, even though Pete couldn't see him. I know, but I don't have a choice. Pete let out a sigh. I'll make some calls. You stay put. Don't let anyone know you're planning to leave. Jake's heart gave a slight thump of relief. Thanks, Pete. You don't know what this means. Don't thank me yet. Pete replied gruffly. This won't be easy, but we'll get it done. You just keep her safe, all right? Jake smiled, the first real smile in days. I will. As he hung up the phone, Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Pete had always come through, and Jake knew this wouldn't be any different. It wasn't over yet, but it was a step in the right direction. He turned to Emma, who was still sitting quietly at the table, waiting. He walked over and sat beside her. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were filled with questions. We're going to be all right, Jake said, his voice steady. We're going to get out of here, Emma. We're going to start fresh. Emma's face softened, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. I believe you, Jake, she said quietly. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake believed it too. They still had a long road ahead of them, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't going to let Emma face the same world he had. Not if he could help it. He wasn't running anymore. He was fighting for her, for a future they could build together, no matter what it took.